The open sea was once the most isolating place a man could find himself. No landmarks, no roads, just endless waves and the hope that the compass hadn't lied. For Commander Ernest Callahan, that isolation was not a fear, but a challenge. He stood on the bridge of the USS Langley, the U.S. Navy's first aircraft carrier, in 1924. Wind battered the steel walls, waves heaved against the hull, and above all, a deafening silence from the heavens pressed down. Without GPS or even reliable radio contact, Callahan was about to do something no man had done before: steer a floating airfield across the open Pacific, guided only by the stars and his nerve. Callahan wasn't alone. By his side was Lieutenant Joseph "Joe" Harrow, a wiry young navigator with eyes that scanned every dial and every flicker in the sky. Joe wasn't a sailor by birth. He was a mathematician-turned-officer, obsessed with calculating positions using nothing but celestial charts and a sextant. To him, the stars weren't just points of light. They were fixed truths in a sea of chaos. And that night, as the Langley left Pearl Harbor to rendezvous with a fleet off Midway Island, those stars would be their only allies. As Langley's bow broke through midnight swells, Joe adjusted his sextant, scribbling angles furiously into a worn notebook. "We're off by a hair," he muttered, checking the readings again. "If we don't correct course soon, we'll miss the fleet by 40 nautical miles. Callahan didn't flinch. He trusted Joe, even if the men below deck didn't. The old-timers in the engine rooms grumbled that Harrow's star magic would sink them. They trusted compasses and instincts, not math. But Callahan had been a battleship officer long enough to know that brute force meant nothing without precision. An aircraft carrier, even one as modest as the Langley, was no longer just a ship. It was a strategic tool, and if it couldn't be placed exactly where it was needed, it was worthless. The deeper challenge wasn't just navigation. Aircraft carriers were massive, slow-turning beasts, unlike the nimble destroyers or cruisers they sailed with. A wrong heading wasn't easily corrected. It took hours, sometimes days, to recover lost ground. And Langley's role in upcoming war games meant they had to be on station precisely, or the entire drill would be scrubbed. As Joe worked through his calculations, clouds began to roll across the moon. His primary celestial references vanished. He flipped to a backup plan: dead reckoning. By calculating speed, heading, and drift over time, he could estimate their position. But this method was dangerous in rough seas, where currents and winds could warp even the best guesses. Joe knew every calculation now carried weight not just for his pride, but for the safety of the 426 men aboard. Meanwhile, down in the operations room, Lieutenant Marissa Kane, one of the few female intelligence officers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, monitored coded transmissions from the other fleet elements. Though her role was technically separate from navigation, she had learned to read the subtle pacing of fleet movements. "Callahan," she said, stepping onto the bridge with urgency. "The cruiser Tacoma just reported altered coordinates. They're adjusting for a southward current. If we don't follow, we'll fall behind." Callahan looked at Joe, whose eyes narrowed. "I didn't factor that current. We're probably a degree north of optimal." "Then we adjust," Callahan said, turning the ship's wheel with a confidence earned from years in steel-gray uniforms. Langley creaked as its giant hull leaned into a new bearing. The ship's course now aligned with nothing visible, no landmarks, no allies in sight. But to Joe, it felt right. His numbers aligned. His stars had spoken. At dawn, after 10 hours of blind navigation, a glint appeared on the eastern horizon. Not the sun. Steel. A column of cruisers and destroyers cruised calmly toward them. The fleet. They had made it. A cheer erupted from the deck, sailors pointing, some even hugging. Joe Harrow let out a long breath. Callahan gave him a single nod, the kind of respect that, in the Navy, meant more than applause. But Marissa Kane's eyes remained on her console. "Signal just came in," she said, voice tight. "We're not done yet. Fleet Command wants Langley to take point in an anti-submarine maneuver tomorrow. They're counting on us to be in place before nightfall. Callahan rubbed the fatigue from his eyes. Then we don't rest. Joe, get me new bearings. Marissa, coordinate with the TACnet. We'll show them this ship can do more than carry planes. She can lead. The crew scattered into motion once again, the momentary triumph already swallowed by the next wave of responsibility. But the message was clear. Navigation wasn't just about finding your way. For an aircraft carrier in its infancy, surrounded by doubt and danger, it was the very proof that it belonged. And in that moment, as the Langley carved a path through the Pacific, the true legacy of carrier navigation began, not with electronics or satellites, but with conviction, calculations, and courage. The Pacific wind had turned colder by nightfall, laced with salt and anticipation. Inside the navigation deck of the USS Langley, the quiet hum of machinery blended with the rustling of charts and the soft clatter of instruments. Lieutenant Joe Harrow was hunched over a table, recalibrating a series of time-distance diagrams. Across from him, Commander Callahan reviewed updated mission parameters received just hours earlier. The new orders weren't just a test of precision, they were a trial by uncertainty. Their new assignment was daunting. Lead the carrier to an exact position 200 nautical miles south by sunrise to intercept a simulated enemy submarine fleet during war games. It was a subtle, high-stakes maneuver that would push the limits of the ship's capabilities and the crew's trust in early navigation science. Down below, the rest of the ship hummed with quiet energy. Flight deck crews stowed away the last of the reconnaissance aircraft, their boots echoing on the steel catwalks. In the mess hall, conversation had grown tense. Rumors spread quickly aboard carriers, and the men knew this wasn't just an exercise. It was a chance to prove the Langley wasn't some experimental relic, but a fully operational strategic asset. Failure would mean ridicule from the fleet. Success would change doctrine. Joe adjusted the ship's gyro compass, frowning as he accounted for magnetic deviation caused by the steel hull. "We're cutting this too close," he muttered. "With these winds shifting westward, we might be 10 minutes late at best." 10 minutes, Callahan replied evenly, is long enough for a torpedo in a real war. Lieutenant Marissa Kane entered the bridge with a folder under her arm and urgency in her voice. New signal intercepts from the Tacoma. Their hydrophone array detected submerged noise patterns consistent with diesel-electric engines, likely part of the simulation. They've altered course again to flank from the east. Joe's head snapped up. That changes everything. If they're circling east and we maintain current bearing, we'll be caught between their formation and open sea. They'll mark us as a target before we're in position. Options? Callahan asked, eyes locked on the horizon, though nothing but darkness stretched ahead. "We can veer west by 8 degrees, hit the position from a diagonal," Joe said. "Risk is we'll be passing through shallower waters and deal with unpredictable currents. But we'll arrive on time. Maybe even early." Callahan nodded slowly. "Make the turn." No announcement went out. The ship began to adjust, its movement barely perceptible at first. Beneath their feet, the hull responded with deep groans as new forces pressed against it. To the untrained eye, the ship still crawled forward like a floating city, but for those on the bridge, it felt like threading a needle at sea. In the Combat Information Center, Marissa cross-checked sonar reports and relayed updates through encrypted lines. She wasn't just processing data, she was interpreting it. "Sub-activity increasing near the edge of the shelf," she said over the comm. "They're trying to spook us, draw us off course." Joe stayed focused on his instruments. The temptation to react to every report was strong, but he knew that unpredictability was the real trap. They couldn't allow their plan to fracture under pressure. Navigation, he'd always believed, was not just about knowing where you were. It was about understanding where you had to be. Hours passed. The stars reappeared through gaps in the cloud cover. Joe stepped outside briefly, peering through a sextant, aligning the familiar constellation of Orion with the edge of the horizon. The readings confirmed his calculations, within 5 nautical miles of target. The adjustment had worked. Below, sailors gathered quietly by portholes and outside mess decks, eyes scanning the water. No one was speaking now. The usual nighttime joking had been replaced by something heavier. The realization that they were not just practicing war, they were practicing survival. At precisely 0450, a sonar ping echoed across the Langley's hull. The simulated enemy had been spotted, 1.3 nautical miles starboard, a perfect intercept window. Cheers broke out in CIC, but Callahan raised a hand to quiet them. "We're not finished," he said. "Plot the evasion. Assume they've already got a firing solution." Joe looked at him. "Even in an exercise?" Callahan's voice was steel. "Always. We don't get second chances in war." Marissa fed him a set of bearing coordinates. Joe adjusted the Langley's heading again, just slightly, creating a narrow escape angle. The massive ship began to pivot gracefully, like a steel whale carving through the sea. Aboard the submarines below, the exercise controllers would see the maneuver and know the carrier was aware, agile, and positioned exactly as doctrine required. The simulated torpedo alert blared across the decks at 0504, a drill, but with real precision. Damage control teams scrambled into position. No one broke formation. The ship moved flawlessly. No panic, no confusion. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, its light bathed the Langley in a golden glow. The fleet's admirals, watching from over the horizon aboard cruisers and scout ships, took note. A message came through at 0600 hours. "USS Langley, flawless maneuvering. Report to forward command post. Immediate debrief requested." Joe exhaled for the first time in hours. Marissa cracked a tired smile. Callahan gave no outward sign of satisfaction. But the bridge officers knew. Something important had just shifted. They weren't just a test platform anymore. The Langley had become a player in naval strategy. But the commander's eyes were already scanning the new coordinates. Another mission loomed. And for this crew, the sea would never stop moving. Below deck, the hum of the engines was like a heartbeat, constant, deliberate, and unyielding. Lieutenant Joe Harrow stood at the edge of the hangar bay, watching a maintenance crew swarm over the exposed underbelly of an F-6C4, one of the early Navy fighters assigned to the Langley's air wing. Though the simulated engagement had ended, the ship wasn't relaxing. It was recovering, recalibrating, always preparing. That was life aboard the Navy's first aircraft carrier, a cycle of pressure and purpose, where downtime simply meant you were one step closer to the next trial. Marissa Kane, clipboard in hand, made her way toward Joe. "Command sent over the after-action report," she said, holding out a folded document. "Langley's maneuvering was rated superior in response time and threat evasion. But there's one line that matters more than the rest." Joe took the sheet, eyes scanning quickly until they locked on the phrase. "Operational capacity confirmed for extended combat simulations." He glanced up. "We're being cleared for live deployment scenarios." Marissa nodded. "We're no longer a training ship, Joe. Command sees us as viable. They'll test that theory soon enough." On the bridge, Commander Callahan was already several steps ahead. The Admiralty hadn't just sent commendation, they sent new orders. A long-range navigation run through fog-heavy waters, simulating evasion of enemy fleets without visual contact. This wasn't just an extension of the previous operation. It was a leap into a far more complex challenge. The Langley would have to navigate by dead reckoning, celestial alignment, and sheer instinct, all while under hypothetical threat. No lights, no radar, no margin for error. "You realize," he told his officers, This is the first time we've been given authority to operate autonomously beyond the combat perimeter. That's not a drill. It's trust." The crew met his words with a quiet sense of duty. They didn't cheer, they simply prepared. As the ship moved out, its massive frame sliced through the sea with surgical precision. The weather turned quickly. Fog rolled in like a silent predator, blanketing the ocean in dense white. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Spotters were posted at all forward stations, and deck crews switched to voice tubes and hand signals, the radios dampened to avoid giving off stray signals. Joe manned the navigation controls, sweating over every calculation. The stars were hidden behind a blanket of cloud, and compass interference made even basic bearings a puzzle. But he remembered what his father, a Navy quartermaster during the Great War, had once told him. When you can't see the stars, remember the sea has a memory. Learn to read the rhythm. Marissa interpreted sonar pings and magnetic anomalies, her team mapping invisible threats like ghosts. They were moving blind, yet with a clarity born from trust in their tools and in one another. Suddenly, a muffled clang echoed from the port side, a simulated hit from an enemy sub in the exercise. Crew rushed into motion, compartments sealed, damage control teams activated. The simulation was designed to test their response, but the fear it triggered was real. For many, it was their first taste of what war would feel like: chaos without warning, the hiss of steam, the thunder of metal. Callahan didn't flinch. "Recalculate intercept angle," he barked. "Initiate evasive pattern Delta 3. We need to clear the threat zone and hold formation." Joe's hands flew over the chart table. "We'll have to shift 30 degrees off course. If we push the engines, we can compensate the time loss in the next hour." "Do it," Callahan said. The Langley adjusted again, its engines groaning under the sudden demand. Somewhere beyond the fog, another Navy ship simulated a second attacker. Marissa's sonar caught it just in time. "Second contact, bearing 121, moving fast." "Shift again southwest," Callahan ordered. "We lead them into the shoals. They won't follow us where it gets shallow." The maneuver was risky. The seafloor there was uneven and dangerous for a vessel Langley's size. But the gamble paid off. The pursuing ship veered away, unwilling to risk damage. It was a victory not marked by explosions or flags, but by silence. Silence meant survival. By the time the fog lifted, the Langley emerged into open sea, sunlight pouring across its deck. They were off schedule by just 4 minutes. In command terms, it was nothing short of surgical. The exercise ended with another message from Fleet Command. Simulation success. Carrier Langley deemed combat ready for open sea operations. Tactical autonomy granted for further deployment. That night, below deck, the crew didn't celebrate. They reflected. They cleaned, repaired, logged, and reset. In the tight quarters of the navigation bay, Joe sat beside Marissa, both too tired to speak, but silently aware of the shift that had occurred. "We're not just a floating experiment anymore," she said quietly. "No," Joe replied. "We're a blueprint." The Langley's mission was never just about today. It was about proving a concept, that aircraft carriers could lead, that navigation without sight was possible, that human intuition paired with evolving technology could outmaneuver even the most calculated threats. And now, with every voyage forward, they weren't just writing history, they were building the path for every carrier that would follow.